Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. I wanted to welcome everybody to our webinar, Technology for Enhancing Functional Health, Monitoring Movement with Wearables and Sensors. I'm Margie Lachman from Brandeis University, and I'm a lead on the Aging Pilot Corps for the Mass AITC. We also can see Amanda Paluch from University of Massachusetts and Jen Blankenship from VivoSense, who are awardees from our pilot program at the Mass AITC. This is an overview of what we hope to present today and accomplish. First, I'll talk briefly about what is functional health and why it is important. I'm just gonna keep track of my time. And then Dr. Paluch will talk about detecting frailty in home environments. Dr. Blankenship will focus on developing real-world biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. And then we're saving time for discussion and questions. We encourage you to put questions in the chat box as well, so you can keep track of your questions and we'll take them from the chat box. So today we'll be focusing on a subset of the Mass AITC goals. Maintaining and promoting functional health and independence is an overall goal. We focus on the importance of functional health for aging in place or aging at home. We focus on the use of technology, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to support healthy aging at home for older adults and those with Alzheimer's disease. We conduct interdisciplinary work with researchers, clinicians, and industry, and we also involve the development of wearables and sensors. Now, functional health is what is needed to live independently. So the activities of daily living are the ability to perform essential activities for physical needs, such as eating, bathing, mobility, grooming, etc. And the higher level, more complex activities called instrumental activities of daily living are those such as managing finances, medications, food preparation. And this good functional health is needed to maintain independence and to age at home. Unfortunately, a large percentage of older adults have disabilities or functional limitations. And if you look at the bars on the right-hand side of the graph, especially the light blue bars, which show the percentage with disability, for those 65 to 74, almost a quarter, 24%, have at least one disability or functional limitation. And if we look at those over the age of 75, close to half, or 46%, have at least one disability or functional limitation. And we can also zoom in and look specifically at different types of disability or limitations. And I'm going to draw your attention to the two on the bottom left here, which are most relevant to what we'll be talking about today. Ambulatory difficulty, or things related to just mobility and walking. And so if we look at those over the age of 75, in the green bar, you can see 35% or more of women have difficulty over the age of 75, and men, it's close to 30%. And with the other disability tied to being able to live independently, we see 30% of women and 20% of men over the age of 75 have at least one disability. Now, functional health and disability are related to quality of life and independence. Some of these factors including muscle strength, balance, agility, mobility, walking distance and speed, energy level, mental health, cognitive ability, social engagement. All of these are aspects of functional health or tied to functional health, and they affect one's quality of life and ability to live independently. Poor functional health and disability are highly associated with an inactive and sedentary lifestyle. There's what we call a vicious cycle of disability and inactivity, and that's depicted here. We see this reciprocal relationship of inactivity and disability. Physical inactivity or sedentary lifestyle at the top feeds into disability and functional limitations. Those who are inactive are more likely to have disability or functional limitations. At the same time, those who have disability or functional limitations are less able to be active physically. They have pain or they have some other mobility restrictions that may curtail their ability to be physically active, and they become more sedentary. Now, we show these recommendations from the CDC about physical activity, at least 150 minutes a week for moderate intensity aerobic activity, and muscle strengthening activity at least 2 days a week. These are the recommendations that are made from the CDC. However, unfortunately, less than 20% of adults engage in the recommended level of activity, and this percent decreases with age. As you can see in the lower left right-hand bars, if we focus on the green, which is the overall amount of activity. For those people between 65 and 74, it's approximately 17%, so less than 20%. And if we look at 75 and older, it's more like 10% engage in the recommended levels of activity. So this puts older adults at great risk for functional limitations and disability. We also, independent of physical activity, are interested in how much time people spend in a sedentary activity or lifestyle. And 9.5 hours a day is considered excessive sedentary time. And if you look at the map on the right, the overall prevalence of excessive sedentary activity in the United States is about 50%. So about half the United States live a sedentary lifestyle. So we sort of set up the stage for functional limitations. We know that there are many health benefits of physical activity. We focus here on the bottom. These are the ones that are, I think, most directly relevant to what we'll be talking about today. Physical activity benefits balance and coordination. Balance affects your fitness and your functional strength. It certainly has widespread benefits for mental health, physical health, and cognitive health. Now, an inactive lifestyle in general increases the risk of many age-related conditions, such as sarcopenia, or muscle weakness, hip fracture, falls, disability, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, nursing home admissions, premature mortality, Alzheimer's disease, frailty, and loss of independence. And it's these last three that are particularly relevant to the talks that we'll be hearing today. So today, what we will focus on are monitoring and early detection to support interventions for functional limitations. We have two of our funded mass AITC pilot projects that are ongoing right now that are very interesting and exciting projects that we're happy to share with you. Our first one will be presented by Dr. Paluch, detecting frailty in home environments through non-invasive whole room body sensing in older adults. And after that, if we will take maybe one or two questions from the chat, so feel free to put your questions in the chat. And then we'll move on to Dr. Blankenship's presentation, developing real-world digital biomarkers using wearable sensors in Alzheimer's disease. We'll then save approximately 10 minutes or so for discussion and questions. We encourage you to use the chat box, and we'll take those questions accordingly. So welcome, and I now want to turn it over to Dr. Paluch for her presentation.
All right, so it's wonderful to be here, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about our study where we're hoping to identify and detect frailty in home environments using whole room body heat sensing in older adults. So in our lifespan, we reach a maximal functional capacity in early adulthood, and then we begin to lose that capacity as we age. And maintaining and monitoring physical function as we age is key to living independently. And we can approach this through the context of frailty monitoring. So today I'm going to be talking about frailty and how we measure frailty and what our approach is through the Mass AITC pilot study. Frailty is defined as a clinical state where we have increased vulnerability that results from deterioration of physiological symptoms. About 10% of community-dwelling older adults have frailty, and this just becomes more common as we age. So the oldest are especially at risk of developing the condition. We particularly see the impact of frailty when a person who has frailty is exposed to a stressor, and this could even be a minor stressor. So say a minor illness, injury, or a minor surgery. We see that focusing on this frail population, when exposed to a stressor, we see large declines in their functional ability, and then this decline happens for an extended period. And furthermore, oftentimes they're not going to return to their original status. So from baseline to post, we see this drop in their functional ability. Whereas somebody who's robust and healthy, this individual will experience less of a decline for a shorter period of time, and oftentimes will return to their original health status. So measuring frailty is essential for several reasons. It allows for this early identification of people who are at risk for health declines. When they experience those stressors, are they going to experience severe limitations in their functional ability and won't be able to return to their original health status? It also allows for more proactive interventions that can help us prevent or slow the progression of frailty. And then additionally, we can think about the mitigation of negative effects of stressful interventions. So this could be something like a surgery. Are we thinking about the proper steps depending on somebody's frailty status in terms of when somebody pre and post surgery in terms of those types of mitigation efforts? And then finally, personalized supportive environments for adults' inherent capacity. So meeting an adult where they are. And we can see there's a variety of interventions for frailty among older adult populations. And depending on their frailty status, will help dictate what type of intervention approaches we'll use. So for example, for a healthy adult who's considered robust, we'll focus on interventions more on preserving and increasing their reserve to maintain their independence. Whereas those on the other spectrum, those who are frail, will focus on improving their quality of life and mitigating the impact of stressors. And for those in between, we'll focus on a little combination of both and seek to prevent the progression from pre-frail status to frail status. So we know that measuring frailty is essential. So how is frailty assessed? So I'm just going to go over a few of the ways that frailty is currently assessed. When we look at it from a clinical assessment, one of the common measures is the Free Frailty Index or Free Frailty Phenotype. Frailty is multidimensional, and thus it's quantified in a multidimensional way. So there's many different frailty assessment tools out there, and this happens to be one of the most common tools that's used for clinical assessment. There's these 5 clinical metrics that indicate an altered energy metabolism and individuals who demonstrate at least 3 of these phenotypes are more likely to experience poor responses to stressors. So we can see that these specific metrics, the specific measurement technique can actually vary depending on the clinic or the research study that's conducting it, but these 5 constructs hold consistent. So for example, we have unintentional weight loss, which is typically measured from a self-report, slowness, which is often measured through a gait speed assessment, low physical activity or inactivity, and oftentimes this is measured through a self-reported questionnaire about the time spent in moderate to vigorous intensity physical activities, and sometimes questions about how often people spend it being sedentary. Another phenotype is fatigue, and this is often from a self-reported exhaustion questionnaire. And then finally, weakness. And weakness, one of the common assessment techniques is grip strength. So these 5 phenotypes give an understanding of the multidimensional, the multi-component way that we help understand frailty. With the growth of technology and artificial intelligence, we have the opportunity to collect data in free living settings now. So looking outside of the clinic and going into free living conditions. And so a simple accelerometer worn at various parts of the body can give us insight into how much activity somebody is doing. And not just actually how much activity, but also when and how we're doing that activity. So for example, this is some ongoing work from our research group where we're interested in understanding, does the pattern throughout the day, can that be an indication of frailty and health status? Or even how we're breaking up our activity. So for individuals, whether we have extended bouts of activity versus extended bouts of sedentary time, do we have a lot of sit to stand transitions how much are we interrupting our sedentary time? These specific metrics that we can get from wearable technology can help us understand perhaps phenotypes of frailty. And even metrics as simple as steps per day could be useful health indicators. So here's another example from our recent work where we demonstrated that the number of steps associated with all-cause mortality differed for younger and older adults. So looking at older adults, focusing on our older adult population in the blue, we see there's a progressively lower risk of mortality with higher volumes of steps per day until leveling at about 6,000 to 8,000 steps per day for older adults. And we see that this was significantly less number of steps per day in compared to the younger adult population for a similar risk reduction in mortality. Now, there have been a small number of studies using wearable technology to specifically identify frailty. This is an example of a study that looks at over 250 older adults, and they wore an accelerometer, a pendant-like accelerometer for 2 continuous days. So this table here shows the primary results of this study. And what we're looking at here is the area under the curve of predicting frailty as well as various phenotypes of frailty. And we see the features that were shown to predict these various dependent variables. And the areas under the curves were actually rather strong. They ranged from 0.6 to 0.8. So the area under the curve for physical frailty model was within an excellent range of 0.8. And the models for slowness, weakness, and inactivity were considered an acceptable range of 0.7 to 0.8. And then finally, the exhaustion model was considered a fair range as well of 0.6. So we can see that these types of movement features can be used as for understanding frailty level in free living conditions. However, we do see that there are some limitations with the existing way that we monitor frailty. So we know that early detection, continuous monitoring of frailty can really support delivering care and supporting older adults in terms of their intrinsic capacity. However, there's a lot of time constraints and resource constraints with measuring frailty in the clinic, so therefore it's not commonly measured in US clinical practice. Additionally, a single time point may not be an indication of real world status. So an individual could come into the clinic on an unusually poor day or an unusually great day, and this might not represent their day-to-day real-world level of frailty. Additionally, as frailty progresses and the associated diseases worsen, we can see that adherence can sometimes go down with wearable technology. So therefore, the goal of our pilot is identifying that there's this critical need for a contactless, low-burden, continual monitoring assessment that is feasible in home environments. And how we propose doing this is using Butler's heat sensors. So these heat sensors install in minutes, they're wireless, they have a long battery life, and they can be used to track in-home activity and movement continuously. And it's in the free living environment, and it actually preserves privacy. So you only get this body heat data and to detect movement and no identifiable information. And so we hope to use the Butler heat sensors to develop heat sensor-based frailty identification algorithms. I'm working with a stellar interdisciplinary team for this Mass AITC pilot project, and this is a multi-PI project, and you can see my 2 co-PIs here. This is Dr. Dae-Hyun Kim on the far right. He's a geriatrician and associate professor at Harvard Medical School, and also features his research focuses on frailty assessment. And then in the middle here, this is Rags Gupta, and he's the Chief Growth Officer of Butler. And this is just a stellar team to work with. I've learned so much from them so far, and I know that I'll just continue to learn from them. I feel like I've only just scratched the surface. To give you a little bit of a background of Butler. So Butler was originally developed for commercial building occupancy detection and use for application in workplace and smart buildings. It can sense occupancy through through body heat and artificial intelligence. And what this allows is to optimize office planning and energy use without capturing any of that identifiable information. So some of the use cases, it can give insights into like foot traffic, occupancy levels, activity that can be used by employers, city planners, and property managers in the commercial use space. And we see that Butler has now entered the health space with this introduction of the application of Butler Care. And they are introducing Butler Care with the idea to support the rapidly growing population of older adults and developing health monitor solutions that can be used by both clinicians and caregivers. So a little bit of a background of how Butler works. So Butler is easily attached to or mounted to a wall or a ceiling using a magnetic mount, and it's going to provide real-time and historical spatial insights to passively monitor resident activity. You can see it provides a 60-degree view of rooms, as well as here's an example of what the data looks like and showing that it's incapable of collecting that personal identifying information. Some of the data that it can track, like I mentioned, occupancy, but it's also going to it's also going to collect some of the trends, some of the activities, the movement throughout the room, how often people are spending in various rooms that will be useful for our frailty assessment. So to further provide some examples of some of the data that we can pull from the Butler heat sensing device, we can gather information on environmental context. So based on pre-labeling items in a room. So this is shown in the upper left corner. Or we can learn how much time is spent in various areas over time, like shown in the lower left. And then also we can get details on movement related to the speed of the movement, how often one is moving, and for how long the movement occurs. So for example, does an individual break up their sitting time often? And when they do break up that sitting time and they're making a move from the living room to the kitchen, how quickly do they move? And then also, because it's continuous monitoring over multiple days, do we see changes in these movement patterns across the day, the week, the month? And all of this contextual information and movement data can be used to help us understand one's frailty status. So we have 3 aims for our cross-sectional study. First, we plan to validate Butler's heat sensor-based algorithms against some wearable technology. And then we hope to identify a frailty-based algorithm using Butler's heat sensing device against a clinical frailty assessment. And then finally, we wanted to understand the acceptability of using the at-home use of Butler sensors in older adults. This provides an overview of our study. So we plan to enroll 60 older adults across the spectrum of frailty. And first, they'll do a clinical assessment of frailty, similar to the free frailty phenotype. We'll do the 5 various phenotypes of frailty to get an idea of somebody's current clinical assessment. And then Butler will be installed and calibrated in the individual's home. And once it's installed, we'll provide an active PAL, which is an accelerometer that's worn on the thigh. And it provides a really great representation of how often people are moving, how intense people are moving, and those patterns throughout the day. After 10 days of wearing the active PAL and while also having the Butler devices installed in their homes, they'll complete an acceptability survey to kind of tell us about how do they feel about having the Butler device installed in their homes. So data scientists from Butler are going to help us process this thermal data using advanced artificial intelligence algorithms to identify what features best predict frailty. So provided in this table here are just a few of the examples of features and the potential phenotype of frailty that this feature can predict. And so, for example, we can see we will be able to detect walking speed, and this might be an indication in terms of the frailty phenotype of somebody's slowness or weakness. Even just their time in home, how often do we see that they are spending time in their home? this could be an indication of fatigue, for example. So this is just a little snapshot of some of the various features that we'll be able to pull and see how they can help us understand frailty in free living conditions. And finally, I wanted to wrap up just to summarize some of the translational use of where we hope this technology will go. Some of the locations, so we're working to understand it in older adults' homes, but it could also be used for assisted living facilities, nursing homes, is also in the clinic. And Butler can provide a window into this predictive care insights. So it's going to it can help us identify subtle changes in behavior that might indicate changes in frailty status. And how can we use this? Some clinical implications are providing that individualized care, thinking about earlier preventive interventions and more timely supportive services. And then also thinking about evaluating effects of treatments. So treatments could be when somebody's in physical therapy, a new medication, a surgery. So not just understanding pre and post, but throughout a therapy, how are people responding? And then also the Butler device, if we're able to identify frailty, it can provide comfort of remote continual monitoring for both formal and informal caregivers. So in summary, we're hoping to identify frailty using the Butler heat sensing device and earlier while somebody's still living at home, and in hopes that this could provide earlier interventions and supportive services and lead to the overall goal of Mass AITC, which is focusing on aging in place for longer.
Hey.
So I would like to thank everybody for the opportunity to talk and look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. We actually have time for a question. We have one in the chat box that I'll read from Julia Boyle. She said, "This is very exciting technology. You mentioned it could determine time spent in each part of the home. Is it able to determine time spent in bed?"
That's a great question. So yes, so you could see one of the images there. You can actually mark where the bed is, and so you can get an idea of time spent in bed. So we wouldn't be able to get exactly how much time spent is sleeping in bed, but it just even time spent in bed could be a nice indication that we will certainly consider when we're starting to look at these frailty algorithms.
Okay. All right, there are a couple more questions, but I think in the interest of time, we're going to move to Jen's presentation, and then we promise that we will take as many questions as possible at the end. So please keep putting your questions in the chat box, and it's possible that Amanda can also respond to some of them in the chat box while Jen is presenting. But our goal is to save about 10 minutes or more at the end for additional questions. So please keep them coming in the chat box. Thank you. All right, now to move to Jen's presentation.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me and inviting me for this presentation. So today I'm going to talk to you about our work at VivoSense developing digital measures of function using wearable sensors for patients with Alzheimer's disease. Now, before I start talking about our work specifically, I'd like to introduce what we do at VivoSense a little bit more broadly. So we're a science and analytics company. We work to develop and validate digital measures and digital endpoints to be used in the regulated clinical trial space. So think pharmaceutical companies using digital measures to understand how their drugs and therapies impact patient lives in real world environments. Our company offers end-to-end services and solutions. So what that means is we work with pharma to help them figure out what are the things they should be measuring for specific clinical populations to understand how their drugs are impacting patient lives. And we have operations teams to help them implement these wearable sensors and technologies in these clinical trials and software to analyze high frequency, high resolution data from these technologies. I sit in our R&D department where we're really working to develop and validate context and population specific digital clinical measures. So as it pertains to the talk today, we have a lot of work going on in developing digital measures that are appropriate for use in this context of regulated clinical trial space in Alzheimer's disease. And this all comes back to functional independence, and that this is an aspect of health that matters enormously to patients with Alzheimer's disease. When you ask patients, their caregivers, healthcare professionals, as you can see in this Venn diagram on the right-hand side, at the center of things that matter to these key stakeholders, maintaining independence, autonomy, and functioning is among the most important aspects of life for this patient population. This is also reflected in how drugs are evaluated in Alzheimer's disease. So there have been a lot of recent news in the world of drug development in Alzheimer's disease. If you're not aware, lecanemab was recently granted traditional approval by FDA for treating early Alzheimer's disease. And what I'll show here are some data from that clinical trial. So the primary endpoint in this pivotal trial for lecanemab was the clinical dementia rating sum of boxes. For those of you not familiar with this endpoint, it's a functional assessment, composite assessment of both cognitive and functional domains. And what it does is it asks informants or people close to someone who has Alzheimer's disease questions about how they're able to function, remember things. There's 8 different domains that it captures. The important thing is this is a primary endpoint for many clinical trials and drug development in Alzheimer's disease, and is the indicator that this drug, in fact, improved or delayed the progression of Alzheimer's disease for patients. An additional endpoint that's often used are these endpoints capturing activities of daily living that Dr. Lachman described earlier. So both aspects, both instrumental and basic activities of daily living, are captured in these scales. I'd like to point out that in both of these cases, these endpoints are assessed intermittently. So at its highest, most frequent resolution, we're looking at assessments every 3 months. And as you know, there's a lot of variability in what's happening with people in between those periods of times. Additionally, these types of endpoints are subject to rater and recall bias. So we're reliant on asking informants questions. So and often these questions reflect very long recall periods. So one example coming from the ADL questionnaires, they're phrased often in the frame of, over the last 4 weeks, has Bob been able to dress himself independently? And while this reflects a high-level depiction of someone's ability to function, it really captures a limited window of what they're able to do and doesn't really holistically reflect their lived experience. They're assessed in clinic settings and don't capture these sort of more everyday functional challenges that older adults may experience in their real-world environments. The other piece that's important, or why this is important in the context of drug development, is that this actually matters a lot to the FDA. And pharma is very responsive to what the FDA wants to hear. So FDA has shifted the drug development approach towards the patient and has launched initiatives called patient-focused drug development over the last decade. And what this means is the FDA is pushing forward initiatives to systematically incorporate the patient's voice throughout the entire drug development process, from the very beginning to identifying what are the endpoints that should be included in clinical trials to demonstrate that these drugs actually matter and impact their lives, all the way through the end, an evaluation of does this actually matter and make sense to me in my daily life. So developing drugs that impact patient aspects of life that matter to patients is of high relevance and importance to FDA. but the ability to actually measure that and capture that is very limited. And Dr. Paluch highlighted a lot of the similar limitations in the previous talk. So there is an unmet need right now to develop new methods to more holistically capture functioning and other aspects related to function that matter to patients with Alzheimer's disease. We see lots of opportunities with wearable actigraphy sensors to fill these gaps. So wearable actigraphy sensors are very low burden and can capture lots of aspects and measures of physical behavior that are carried out in daily life. So things like walking and physical activities, sedentary behaviors, but also sleep and other things that are difficult to measure when you ask somebody to recall that. These technologies are low burden. You can wear them continuously, passively, to assess people moving and capture aspects of function both in and outside of the home. While they don't provide the entire picture, they can provide a really complementary data stream to existing measures of function that ask participants to subjectively report how they're doing. One of the advantages and spins that we pitch to pharma at VivoSense of why these tools would be really beneficial in the context of drug development is they have the potential to detect treatment effects more efficiently than existing endpoints. So as I showed you on the previous slides, many of the endpoints in Alzheimer's disease and across other clinical trials are assessed episodically over extended periods of time, leading to long duration clinical trials. That translates to high costs for pharma and high costs of drug development. By enabling these digital health technologies and wearable sensors and identifying endpoints that potentially capture changes with higher sensitivity, you have the potential to detect treatment benefits or lack of benefit more efficiently, quickly, resulting in an increase in the speed of overall of the drug development cycle. So while wearable sensors have been really, I would say, quite prevalent in the context of the research space, they're less well adopted in drug development and in the pharmaceutical space. So in part, this is due to some gaps in evidence. So one of the pieces of evidence you need to bring to the FDA when you're demonstrating that your endpoint, a new digital endpoint, is showing or measuring something important in your clinical trial, is that endpoint actually is measuring the thing that you say it's measuring. So in the case of wearable actigraphy sensors, there's a high potential to use them to capture aspects of walking behavior, which are central to mobility and functional independence. The challenge or caveat is that most of the algorithms that are available to derive measures of walking behavior from these sensors were developed in healthy populations. And this is very problematic because there is ample evidence to demonstrate that when you apply those algorithms that were developed in healthy populations in cohorts that have slower walking patterns or clinical populations like individuals with Alzheimer's disease, you have a significant algorithmic bias. So this figure on the right-hand side shows at different gait speeds, the percent error, percent difference from manually counted steps that these two different actigraphy sensors are generating. And what you can see that as the walking speed gets slower, so as we move to the left on this figure, the percent error gets much larger. This is problematic if you're going to claim that these sensors are capturing an endpoint that matters for your patient population. So this measurement problem is really central to our Mass AITC pilot project and work in our R&D department. So our long-term research goals are to obtain regulatory qualification of a real-world digital measure of function for patients with Alzheimer's disease. What this means is that a qualification is a regulatory opinion that the thing that you're trying to measure is indeed well defined and a reliable assessment of that thing. And what it allows is for pharma to use that measure in their clinical trial, and the FDA will accept that this is good enough for regulatory decision making. So the evidence that's needed to get that regulatory qualification opinion is evidence that the measure that you're capturing actually matters to patients. You can reliably quantify it with a given piece of technology or approach, and it's clinically relevant. So there's clinical significance that it matters to the disease itself. So this feeds into our Mass AITC pilot study, which has 3 aims. The first of which is to address the measurement problem that I have described to you by developing and validating novel machine learning methods to detect walking behaviors from inertial sensors. Our second aim is to validate the clinical meaningfulness of digital biomarkers of real-world walking behavior in real-world environments. And our third and final aim is to evaluate that these technologies are feasible and acceptable for use in real-world environments. And what you'll see is that these aims really align with the evidence that's needed to demonstrate this for regulatory qualification. So this is very much the beginning stages of this work, but I'd like to just, I just want to highlight where we're going in the long term with this. Our team similarly is a multidisciplinary academic industry collaboration, bringing together experts in digital health, aging, signal processing, and motion capture systems to execute this project. So in our study, we'll recruit 20 older adults, both with and without a self-reported diagnosis of mild Alzheimer's disease. All participants will be at least 65 years or older and free from other types of dementia, traumatic brain injury, or cerebrovascular stroke. All participants will, like I said, have a self-reported diagnosis. On a high level, our study has 2 components, an in-lab component where participants will visit the motion capture laboratory at UMass Amherst, where they'll perform multiple walking tasks while wearing several wearable sensors you can see at multiple wear locations, while being video camera or assessed with a motion capture system. So our truth data will be coming from the motion capture system data. And those data will be used to develop machine learning algorithms to derive measures of real-world walking behavior. Those algorithms will then be applied to another data stream that we're collecting, which is 2 weeks of real-world monitoring. So for participants, will be asked to wear monitors both on their wrist and thigh for 2 weeks to assess their functioning and walking behaviors at home. We'll evaluate group differences in these measures of walking behavior to look at whether some of these outcomes can detect differences in older adults with and without Alzheimer's disease. After participants complete the wearable sensor period, they'll be asked to complete a questionnaire, which will ask about questions about their wearable sensor experience. And I'll say that there's very limited data that's actually that is understood how patients with Alzheimer's disease accept this type of technology. So this is relatively novel. The other aspect that we're doing is we're actually returning data back to participants. So we'll be generating a summary report of their walking behavior and give that back to them after they complete that 2-week wear period. And they'll complete a questionnaire to evaluate how meaningful that data is to them. So this is a very important topic and an area of conversation in the pharma world. How do we deliver wearable sensor data back to participants in a meaningful way? And these data will generate that type of evidence. So I've talked a lot about the use of digital measures and digital endpoints in the context of drug development and pharmaceutical world, but we do see the long-term vision and potential for these types of technologies to really enable a better care model for patients with Alzheimer's disease and older adults without. This type of monitoring can help facilitate conversations, identify points at which significant changes in function are happening, and help guide treatment decisions. So our hope is that this type of technology sort of enables a more connected model of care in the future. So with that, I'll stop. My email address is listed up here. I'm happy to take any questions and have any conversations on or offline. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. So as promised, we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. I appreciate the efficiency of Amanda and her co-investigator, Dae Kim, who have answered many questions already in the chat. So as the moderator, I'm going to take the prerogative or privilege to ask the first question, and then we'll start taking additional questions as well. So this is really directed at both Amanda and Jen. What are the anticipated barriers to adopting these technologies, either from patients or older adults in general, clinicians, researchers? Do you anticipate any barriers to adopting these kinds of technologies, both wearable sensors and non-wearable sensors? So let's start with Amanda.
Yeah, that's a great question, Margie. I think one of them that we really hope to further understand is, are older adults willing to install these in their homes? So how this works is we're going to ask them to install in various rooms, and how willing are they to actually share this data and have somebody come and install them in their homes. And so that's actually one of our major purposes of this study. So I don't think we know the answer yet, particularly for this new type of technology, but we really hope to dig into that and understand it a little bit more.
I'll add, in the context of our work, wearable sensors and understanding the usability and feasibility aspects in Alzheimer's disease is very not well understood. There's some evidence or a lot of bias, I think, in the pharma world, that they're skeptical that patients will actually wear these types of sensors. Will a population that is historically has memory problems remember to put them on and off? I think that's a major question, but a barrier that I think is overcome by the fact that there's been a lot of advances in sensor technology, that we have technologies that have extended battery lives, that don't require frequent charging and don't require people to really remember. It's sort of a set it and forget it type experience for the patient. But of course, these questions are important to ask and generate evidence.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really great answers. So I'm going to read a question from Julie Recant. I believe this would be for Jen. Do you anticipate needing a different machine learning algorithm for gait detection in your different populations?
Yeah, this is precisely one of the questions that we're seeking to answer. So best case scenario, we have one algorithm that works for everything, but that's so unlikely to be the case, and actually has been shown to not be the case. So a one size fits all model approach to analyzing actigraphy data is flawed. So I think it's very possible that we require different algorithms, but I think it's also possible that there may be other measures that help us identify when one algorithm A is appropriate versus algorithm B. So one of the aspects of health that we're capturing is somebody's functioning as assessed by the short physical performance battery, and the presence or absence of different physical impairments may be one piece of it, level of information that helps dictate which types of an algorithm, whether it's applied or another one.
Thank you. So I'm going to read a question from Amy Lowe. Thank you for the important contribution to the field. Question for Jen. I wonder, since there are multiple levels of cognitive status intact, SCD, MCI, mild, moderate, and severe dementia, do you plan to classify the gait behavior across all of these cognitive status, or simply yes versus no AD?
Yeah, so right now we're focusing on mild AD versus healthy, older, cognitively intact adults. The goal, I think, for us is to target those early phases and certainly look at MCI down the road. Assessing gait in more moderate and severe dementia, I think that's an important research question, but given that a lot of these clinical trials are focused on enrolling older adults or adults that have MCI, mild AD, and looking at the progression and delaying progression early on, that's where the focus of our efforts are right now.
Thank you. So I'll take one more question from the chat, and then I'll open it up for actually if people want to unmute and ask a question. We have enough time for that. So this is from Amar Basu. General question for both speakers. What kind of physiological biomarkers would be useful to have besides motion and actigraphy? What are the challenges to getting these physiological markers? This is blocking my thing. To validate, or wait a second, something flipped in front, so I can't, hold on one sec. Physiological markers accepted by the FDA for clinical relevancy. So maybe
well, I'll get us started, Jen,
yeah,
and then maybe you can talk about the FDA part of it. But in terms of, that's a really great question in terms of what other physiological biomarkers can we get from some of this technology. And I think one example of many could be something like heart rate variability, where we're getting heart rate, and that could be an indication of somebody's, from a frailty perspective, somebody's fatigue. So even simple metrics like that we can get from wearable technology that continue to improve. You know, they're not perfect in heart rate, but during sleep they can be somewhat reliable. So those types of metrics I think could be useful as well when we think about monitoring from a frailty perspective.
Yeah, and from the perspective of the regulatory clinical trial space, it's not all, I think, or there's been this desire that more data is better. Let's measure everything that we possibly can, and there's a lot of sensors that can capture things, lots of physiological measures beyond heart rate, like temperature, respiration, breathing rates. You can go down a rabbit hole very quickly. Our approach is always to take a step back and think about what the inputs are, like what does it feed into. So we have work in detecting sleep with actigraphy sensors and developing improved solutions to capture sleep more accurately in people who have interrupted sleep patterns. And in that work, we're looking at integrating multi-sensor approaches, looking at first adding in heart rate data from PPG sensors, but also thinking about respiratory data that you can capture from different types of mobile technologies.
Okay, I see a couple more questions in the chat, so I may as well take those. Elizabeth Mahan asked if you're, I think this would be for Jen, if you're taking self-diagnosis, how would you avoid accidentally measuring people with undiagnosed Parkinson's, which would also have memory issues, and displaying bradykinesia in your walk assessment?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think an important limitation that we have to acknowledge in our work. This is certainly a pilot project, so we have to be able to complete this within in the defined time period. In terms of identifying bradykinesia, we do have some functional assessments at screening to screen out people who have very severe walking problems, I'll say. But this is, it's going to be hard to address this, and these are limitations of working in a clinical population in this context, but that's a great point.
Emma Arjun says, thank you for sharing. Both projects are exciting. Jen, are there specific gait parameters you are focusing on as your markers to validate or use as clinical markers and outcomes?
Yeah, we're looking at a lot of different types of features of walking behavior, your standard step count, step rate, but also how people accumulate their steps in different walking bouts, stride length, stride velocity. There's quite a few that we're exploring at this stage. But the important thing is that we plan to go back to participants to ask them, these are the things we've found. Does this resonate? Does it make sense to you? Does it apply to your life?
Margie, I might just jump in if you don't mind.
Of course.
And first of all, to thank Jen and Amanda and you, of course, for an amazing presentation. I want to push slightly outside of functional health and frailty for a second. And this is sort of an extension of Amar Basu's question, that these same sensor-based technologies could in theory be used for a wide variety of other applications, where other problems of healthy aging or for monitoring other aspects of functional health. And so I'm just wondering, if I asked you to speculate, and from our laundry list of potential problems, so identification of clinical decompensation of any variety of types, or early identification of other health-related problems, for the two use cases that you've offered, sort of wearable actigraphy and radar-based technology, or rather preserving sensor technology. What other use cases do you think they could be applied to?
Okay, I can kick it off. So we have current work that is looking at if we can use these types of technologies and similar endpoints to characterize quality of life outcomes. So as I mentioned before, this sense of patient-focused drug development is really being pushed forward, and understanding how drugs impact endpoints beyond your hard traditional outcomes. So in this case, we're looking in lung cancer, whether there are different types of measures of physical behavior to better capture quality of life and physical functioning in that population, with the end goal of supporting this patient-focused drug development.
And to talk from the Butler perspective of other use case scenarios, another thing that they're interested in looking at is fall detection. So they can actually understand, based on what the image looks like in terms of these heat images, if somebody's falling. And they're actually kind of in the process of starting to think about how to test this in nursing home facilities, and using that as kind of a useful use case scenario.
Great. Thank you both.
Thank you. Okay, well, it's 4 o'clock and I guess our time has come to an end, and I just want to thank both Amanda and Jen for fantastic presentations, and for everyone here for attending and for your really thought-provoking questions. It's been a really interesting, informative webinar, so thank you all.